Okay. Metta is the foundation for Karuna. It's as if it's sort of like the principle from which Karuna is operating out of. So if you don't know about it, then learning about Karuna will be a step, will be skipping a grade. Um, so I'll touch on it in the first quarter or third, and then we can go into Karuna. Um, so the state of metta, it's the first of the qualities of the Brahma Vihara as presented in the suttas. And the goal of the presentation of the Brahma Viharas is to afford the meditator a protective and safe and workable environment for their consciousness. It's to give them a dwelling space like the Brahmins, that which is peaceful and able to reside in the positive emotional states continuously. It's not given as a prescriptive solution to a particular problem as much as it's given as a dwelling space for you to transition yourself into permanently, and to do so does require a very high degree of determination, but even more than determination, it requires understanding and wisdom as to why this would be something worthwhile to endeavor in the first place. If you're going to go through all this effort, you have to understand what the value is that you're trying to accomplish through metta. And oftentimes, what I see is people value metta, or they do metta because they almost feel they should, or they feel as if it's good for other people. But sometimes there isn't the understanding of the actual benefits that you yourself gain out of cultivating loving kindness towards those around you. So that's what I'm going to talk about is the reasons that will benefit you specifically as an individual, because I happen to understand that people's self structures don't tend to take upon determinations unless they selfishly have an investment in it. And to say it's for other people only goes so far as people will only do that as much as they think it will make them look better towards themselves, and with other people. So it's quite shallow, and I won't go into that much. So anyway, why is this helpful for me? Say as a practitioner, why should I want to be in a state of loving kindness towards everybody? Um, the first reason is that it will protect you from the states of anger. It will protect you from the states of uh, irrationality in regard to groups of people, um, and it provides a basis for insight. Is another reason. The reason it provides a basis for insight is because when you attempt to do vipassana or even shamatha, we'll just stay with vipassana. If you attempt to do vipassana, you try to start seeing reality clearly from a state of anger, or from a state of jealousy, or from a state of frustration with another. All of which these are all states that are ameliorated through cultivating metta. If you're in one of those states and you try to perceive reality, you'll start to if you notice and are perceptive, you'll see that your perception of reality is distorted. Um, as if you've been drinking a lot that last for like the last few hours, or if you're extremely tired, or if you got like a partial lobotomy. Even it's like you that's kind of a joke, but in reality, your capacity to perceive things in reality clearly in states that aren't positive are very uh, impaired. An example is, if you haven't cultivated metta, most people's protocol is this: if you love somebody, you will hate the person that mistreats that person that you love. So if you create a condition, or you create a boundary in which you say, I love this part of reality, but I don't, what you're basically saying is, I will hate anything that tries to destroy that part of reality. So if you only love a particular group of people, a particular person, and everyone else is you don't love them. Maybe they're not your enemy yet, but they will become your enemy if they hurt that which you love. So without loving kindness, you're existing in a position where the conditions for hatefulness are always present. So you're never quite safe, and you're always in this position where you could create hatred. Um, Now, an interesting thing happens when you start to engage mentally or think about the person who hurt the person that you loved. Your mind is biased towards warping reality against them. So you start to see them as more evil. You start to see everything they do as bad. You start to create narratives about how evil they are, and you almost think of them as like a almost a purely bad person in the mind. This is an abstraction that one creates through the distortions of hatred. And then later you might recognize that this person is actually just a human being. They're actually not that bad. But what happened when you were in a state of hatred was you created all these narratives and stories, and you look back and you're just like, you might have acted in ways that you don't agree with now that you're in a lucid state. So if you don't have the solution to angers and the solution to dealing with people who will take away the things that you love, then you will find ways to hate other people. And from that state, you won't have much luck in the path, because your ability to cultivate insight will be you'll be very inebriated, let's just say that. Um, and these states of anger persist even when you're not attending them. They still influence the way you think. They influence the way that you sleep, and it affects you even if it's not necessarily fully conscious or fully what you're attending to. So if we have a lot of hatred for people, it will affect us in subtle ways that we may not have the ability to perceive. So that's one of the reasons metta is extraordinarily beneficial, is because it will provide you with a basis for serene perception. When you have a state of loving kindness and you treat everyone as equals, not equals, but as worthy of value, you don't have an interest in taking sides. So you don't tend to warp things as much as you would warp them otherwise. And this applies to yourself too. You know everything that you've done that's evil. You know everything that makes you unworthy to be loved and unworthy for things. You have the full history of that. And without loving kindness, you're biased towards yourself. So trying to do vipassana will even be biased towards thinking you deserve this or that, when you're trying to look at reality clearly and lucidly. Deserving something has no meaning. It's not helpful when you're trying to investigate things. And you want to get out of the paradigm of deserving of love and not deserving of love. You want to go.
Hey, Julian.
Yeah.
Yeah, your mic's still cutting out a little bit. I also have a question.
Yeah. Let me just see if I can maybe. Let me see. Oh wait, I know what it is. Okay, this should be better.
Yeah, no, it's pretty loud. I think we could just lower you then.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I also had a question, because you said, I think you even mentioned this right in the beginning, and I've heard like Proctor talk about it, but you said that meta can be a basis for insight. But like, would you say that meta would be a basis for higher insight? Because isn't insight already a prerequisite to begin to develop? Because you can't just. I feel like that's what a lot of people start out with. They start doing meta, and they love these people and they're kind to them, but they don't know. They don't know why they're doing this. They're just, like you said, they feel like they should be. It's kind of prerequisite to understand why you should. Like, you see how things arise in yourself and how it kind of happens on its own.
Yeah. You can do it either way. The cultivation of insight and the cultivation of metta are like a lot of things in the path, where they feed into each other. They're sort of mutually dependent. So
Yeah.
if you feed one, it feeds the other, and if you feed the other, it feeds the one. So it doesn't quite matter what angle you take it at, as long as you're dedicated to that. It will appear on the other side. Same with shamatha and vipassana. You have one. You work on shamatha, you enter stages of vipassana. You do vipassana, you enter stages of shamatha. It has to be that. It seems to be that way. And in this case, it's the same. In regards to people doing it because they feel they should, they're not going to get the benefits of it if they're not doing it with authenticity, in the sense that they're not genuinely cultivating a state of lovingness for the purpose of the other person. If they're doing it for the purpose of themselves, they'll likely receive the fruits of selfishness, but they won't receive the fruits of metta. They won't even go into the insight stages because they haven't set the conditions for metta, sort of, so to speak, to actually work. They've just set up the conditions for themselves to get frustrated. Often. Sometimes they can actually do it authentically, but I think it's more rare than not.
Your mic's still cutting out a little bit, by the way. Sorry. It's just,
Yeah, I don't know.
it's like when you're speaking your sentences, it's like,
I'll just turn off all the compression.
yeah.
It might be kind of staticky and loud, but since I'm talking
okay.
most of the time. All right. All right, how is this?
Speak like a sentence.
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. This is a sentence. This is a sentence. 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, that's better.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
All right. Yeah, so we're going to go into that more, the actual emotional quality of it. I'm just describing some of the reasons, the points that it's actually useful. Because if the points that, like I mentioned earlier, if the points that it's actually going to be useful to you aren't yet understood, you're not going to take it up. So you'll hear this talk, it'll be interesting for some time, but it won't actually influence any of your behavioral patterns, which is the point. If you're practicing, you're trying to recondition yourself and take 1% of it is understanding the teaching and 99% of it is applying it. Like sort of 1% of, lawn work is getting the shovel, and the 99% is actually shoveling for the next, 4 days until you get enough dirt out so you can put a pool in. So I'm trying to give you guys the shovel in that sense. Not saying I have the key for you, because I don't. Only you do. So it's a basis for insight. The second thing is that it's actually it's a delightful experience to reside in a state of metta towards others. If you have no ill will and you only have an interest in other people's well-being, what it does is it protects you from anger. You don't get angry at people because you don't perceive them as someone who is worth being hateful towards. If they've made a mistake, they're deserving of patience, because you could make that mistake too, and you start to see things more from the perspective of, if I were to be this person, what would make the experience the most helpful for me if I were to be that person. And then you do that with people, and it makes sense if you understand the value of what someone like that in your life is. Like if you have someone in your life who's not judging you, who's bringing you up most of the time, they're not looking for reasons to critique you, but they're looking for reasons to give you permission to be happy, to be in a state of love. These types of people are the people that influence you the most. These are the teachers in your life that you actually remember and don't just immediately forget and curse as soon as your class is over. This is the parent who raises a child not from a place of needing that child to be a certain way, but they raise that child to be exactly who they are, and they give the child the equipment to love that who they are. And that child typically will grow up with emotional rigidity, or not a rigidity, but maturity, that's light years ahead of where we're at in society. And so they'll be much more positions to be committed to what they want to do. They'll be able to handle hiccups. They'll be able to love themselves regardless of whether they have a lot of money or little money. So this type of person will set up the conditions for other people to be better people. And if you have enemies around you, the thing that you want those enemies to be is better people, so they stop doing the things that are agitating and disruptive. And if you end up being hateful towards your enemies or the people that are hurting those people that you love, they will find ways to attack you, and they will find ways to be more unskillful because you're like fueling their fire through more hatefulness. You can just see this immediately. If someone's getting upset in a fight, the other person, all they have to do to increase the probability of that fight unfolding is to also get angry. What reverses the polarity is if the other person is in a state of care for the other person's well-being and deflates the situation, and that's a very skillful thing to know how to do and have premeditated, and to understand that you have to practice this, and it's not something you can just do when you're in the place of emergency or whatever. It's something that you have to have cultivated in the same way you have to build wealth, and you can't just all of a sudden when you want to start a business, you can't just get all the money. You have to have had a foundation where you've cultivated wealth, so when the opportunity arises, you can act. Um, emotional skill is similar to wealth. It's best cultivated in silence with yourself when things aren't that interesting, but it's most useful when you have the opportunity to use it. So so yeah, it's a lot more pleasant. It's delightful. It's it's an abiding, really. It's a refusal to step into anger. It's a refusal to step into states of jealousy. It's a refusal to see anyone less than yourself. And from that, you take everybody's power away to affect you as well. You're no longer able to be influenced by other people's debauchery. You're no longer able to be tyrannized by people who want to exploit your weaknesses, your insecurities. It sets up the conditions inside where you don't have an interest in validation from people, because everything, like I mentioned, metta is for yourself too. If you have metta for yourself, all the validation you need is already there. Um, you give yourself the validation. No one can give it to you from that point forward, because that's the most loving thing. You recognize the most loving thing for you to do is to be able to do that with yourself, and stop taking away the qualifications, the necessity to be a certain type of way in order to love yourself. You stop saying, once I get to this goal, once I prove this to this person, once I get this much money, once I have this partner, I will then love myself. You stop doing those games, and you stop participating in these types of patterns in the mind. And you unequivocally, under all circumstances, provide yourself with the care and the validation and the love that you have cultivated inside, and that you don't ask questions about. You just offer it to yourself in the same way if you had good quality parents, they did to you when you made mistakes. And that takes all the power away from everyone else around you completely. Like, they still have power in that they share good ideas with you, and you still can hear like rational arguments about yourself, even critiques of yourself, but there's no longer this sting that if they say something that is harmful, that you then give them permission to basically make you sick, emotionally sick. You take the power away. Like, you basically pull people out of your system, and you unconditionally love them as well, and they feel that from you, and so you're very harmless to them. You're not an enemy. They're not worried about you. You're the person they go to open up to be real with, to be human with, because you recognize humanity, you recognize people make mistakes, you recognize that perspectives are based on conditions of growing up, and you are very able to be flexible with others. And the more flexible you are with every type of person, every type of religious group, every type of ethnicity, every type of gender, every type of people on political spectrums, the wiser you become. Because the more you recognize every type of person, every type of configuration is looking for the same thing. They're all looking for love. They're all looking to be safe, and they're all looking to be well and happy. And this is the basis that everyone's operating out of. Yet everyone has different ideas about how to do that, and their ideas aren't necessarily going to be extraordinarily structured, rational, and grounded arguments based on high investigation. It's based on expediency. It's based on their situations they grew up in. It's based on who hurt them. It's based on a lot of things that we don't know about. And so Metta is aware. Metta understands this is samsara, and this is a place that is very challenging. And every single being wants love. Every single being wants happiness. And Metta understands that deeply, and it respects it, and it honors it in everything, in every being, in every creature. And it sees basically only that. Anything other than that isn't relevant, because everything other than that is a result of karma. It's a result of not having influences that were able to correct the unskillful patterns they have. And now if you have this attitude, you then become an influence for your enemies, for the people that you hate, or the people that you used to hate. You now become that influence for them to start to evolve themselves. Whereas before, all they confronted was either their own dogmatic side and the opposition, who were enemies. Now they come across you, say someone who maybe has a different perspective, but also loves them equally. That breaks their paradigm and affords them the opportunity to move out of, say, what is causing them pain. So not only is it protective of you, but it affords everyone who you may have considered unhelpable the ability to be helped, because that's what love does. Its nature is to unbind. So it's protective, it's delightful, it helps others, it recognizes the nature of how people come to the positions they're in life. It's not just a simple practice of wishing people well, it's an understanding. And that understanding isn't gained through repetition, it's gained through investigation of the causes of why people are the way they are, why we do what we do. And really, if you investigate the causes of yourself, this is an automatic result, is that you start to recognize other people are operating from the same perspectives, from the same limitations that we started in, that we're operating out of. And our limitations lead us to unskillful actions, and we can only hope that those who are more wise than us have enough love to see past our own limited perspectives and start to touch our hearts, such that we could be free, such that we could experience bliss and love. And from that experience of bliss and love, that affects everybody and everything. And to be fortunate enough to have that experience is, it will show how wrong we are in our perceptions of other people, and how worthy all beings are for an openness and affording of compassion. And that's why sort of metta is tied into compassion. Metta, Karuna, and Mudita are all the same. It's just ways of pointing out different qualities of this emotional state. And it's an understanding as well. It's not just emotional state. It's not just necessarily a flurry of chemicals. It's linked to drawing connections between disparate aspects of reality and seeing how people are actually not evil. People are actually acting out and being evil because their perception of how to be happy has been warped by whatever parts of experience are people in their lives. And it is their responsibility. It is their job to to see it and to start to grow from it, but um, the conditions that led them to be where they are, they're still doing the best they can. They're still doing the best they can. So is everybody here. Um, your life right now is a result of the best you can do. Um, you might say you can do better, but if you could, you would be doing that. So you can't do better if you think you could, because if you could, you would be doing it already. Because that would be, if you can't do what you could, it means there's a block, there's an obstacle that hasn't yet been dealt with. That is pretty common. But anyway, so if we want to touch on compassion, uh, metta, I think I kind of was able to tie in compassion with that. But compassion is this truly what happens with, so I'll make a tangent. What happens a lot with people who go into places where they help people, maybe therapy, or they go to help impoverished countries, or they help sexually abused people. What happens is often they empathize with the parties that they're helping to such a degree that their hearts and their minds start to become warped and start to become frustrated and angry because of the way the world has treated certain types of people. Because if you start to look at what's happening in the world, whether it's what we're doing to animals, or what we're doing to each other, or what we're doing to young girls in certain countries, or what we're doing to entire groups of people in North Korea, if we start to look at these lucidly, the only reasonable response is either to cry or to lose hope in a way, to have sort of a broken spirit from this. The reasonable response from sort of like a traditional societal emotional skill set. So just an average person, this is the typical and most reasonable response. And most people will support you in that. They'll say, that's okay to cry towards these things. It's sad. What the Buddha is suggesting is, while this is not being approved of, while these things are not being said to be okay, he's suggesting that you don't then contribute suffering to the mix of stuff, to the mix of things, which is a stance of exceptional maturity, and it is a stance of exceptional compassion. And it requires an understanding that these things happen in the world, and people lose people, people are killed, people are mistreated, and these things happen. And the most effective way I can relate to these atrocities isn't to reduce my effectiveness and my ability to be well. It's to learn to be open, but also unaffected by the tragedies people may face. And that's compassion. Compassion takes yourself into account as well. And compassion doesn't say never show emotion. It doesn't say never demonstrate sort of the motions of emotionality, of sorrow. But what it does say is, don't in that process attach to the need to have it go the other way. Sort of like the emotional system, when you start to like work on it at higher, more subtle levels, it's very easy for that emotional system to sort of, there's a lot more energy And so even for me sometimes, there's like this, uh, there's a swelling often, and that can sometimes come out in the form of tears, or the form of like this swellingness of this emotionality of this such like it can arise as the feeling of you care so much, you care so much, and you care about yourself, and it's like this, it's like this it's like grace, it's it's beautiful, it's very powerful. Karuna is very powerful. It's and it's directed towards anybody who's suffering. It's not just directed towards those in the worst situations. It's to anybody who's suffering. The analogy used in the suttas is to see the one who's suffering from greed, aversion, distraction, and lower mind states as one sees a leper. So this comes into when we start to see other people who are falling into anger, who are falling into states of suffering, who are falling into deep states of sorrow. We have to recognize that we need to be well if we're going to be of effect to them. Just like a doctor who's treating those who are sick doesn't feel the impulse to become sick himself in order to assist those who are dealing with the sickness. I'm not telling you to be a doctor to people, but I'm saying to assume one needs to be also angry isn't necessarily intelligent. And it's good to start to see these states of anger, the states of hatred, the states of lust, the states of aversion and craving as sicknesses. Until we start to recognize that these are not skillful states, these are actually states that create physical pain in the body, literal pain, essentially. You could call it discomfort, but it's pain, and nonetheless. This is I'm not well. I'm not well. If these are states that I abide in, anxiety, anger, jealousy. I'm pretty sure that it's been proven that the releasing of the hormones associated with these states are very contributing to chronic illness and the accelerating of aging as well. So from a health standpoint, that's one benefit, but the real benefit is that your experience in your body and in your mind is much more peaceful. So that's why Karuna also protects you. Is we often, when someone gets angry at us, or when someone is spiteful, or someone is cursing, or someone is really acting out, someone who's just we all have these types of people in our lives who just act unskillfully sometimes. Instead of becoming also, as a child would, throwing tantrums and getting upset and resorting to low-level attacks, resorting to low consciousness methods to extract joy in whatever demented way they may be thinking is they're extracting joy. Instead of doing that, we resolve to be compassionate towards the individual who has fallen into a state of anger, or who's fallen into a state of hatefulness, because compassion understands to be in those states is very uncomfortable. It's very it's also very delirious, because there's this sort of helplessness in those states where we don't have joy in those states, and we feel as if the joy we have has been taken away, and it's the other person's fault. And not only is that not true, so in that state we give our power to another person. Um, so we actually are not only in a joyless state, but we set up the conditions to not be able to get ourselves out of it. We set the conditions up to become uh, dependent on another person's behaviors to start to access the states of joy again. When we're in hatred, we give the person we're hating the power, our power to be joyful, because we hate them because of something, some type of way they are, and we want them to fix the way they are, or we want them to get punished. And until that happens, we resolve not to be happy, or we resolve to have our joy stifled. So this is basically, you're giving the power either away to the person or the system in charge of that person, and the system in charge of that person and that person aren't worthy of your joy. I would say that would be a foolish. It'd be foolish to give your keys to those institutions or those people. It's a good analogy to think of it as giving your keys away to the mind. Is essentially what we're doing when we enter anger or hatred. Is we're saying, I have a key to my mind and my emotional well-being, and I'm going to give the key to my emotional stability to another person, because I think that person is I'm trying to just say this out loud because it's not logical, but we do this. I'm going to give the key to this person that upset me because they're not skilled, so I want them to have the key to my mind and my heart. Does that make sense? No, it doesn't. It's but we do it because we're conditioned to do it, and that's how powerful brainwashing is from our society. That's how powerful it is. Is we are extremely logical beings, yet we act in extremely illogical ways, and we haven't yet figured out how not to do that. And that's because the primary aspect of our experience isn't intellect, isn't thoughts, and isn't logic. It's emotions. And until we learn to start mastering the emotional stages or levels of our mind, we're not going to escape the tribulations of suffering and pain. And it's pretty funny too. Like think how smart we are, but we haven't worked through this. That should be a hint that we're not working. Typically, people aren't working at it at a level that it can be solved. The level it can be solved isn't at the level of the intellect. Some things can be solved and worked through, but it's at the level of the heart. It's at the level of am I loving this person, or am I hating this person? And starting to become very sensitive and very wise to what the heart is doing in every given moment. And when it starts to slip into hateful states or jealous states, the mind needs to be trained to recognize that when it happens, notice the consequences of if I continue down this path, and then resolve to stay in a state of lovingness, of compassion. And people get stuck up on this because they think there's something they need to understand to do this. This is not as much about your understanding and intellect. It's more about the quality of courage. It's more about courage than it is about your intellect and how well you understand metta, how well you understand compassion. And you can't teach courage. You have to do courage yourself, because you're stepping into the unknown. You could talk about it your whole life, but if you do that, it's the path of a coward, because the option to actually do it is there always for you. But anyway, so that's some on compassion. There's an opening for questions. Comments
Yeah,
as
I
well.
have a question. So whenever you're trying to do this, and you're in that position where somebody's acting out, and me personally, my end goal is to try to help them, you know. So what is the end goal, and how can you help somebody when they're in that moment? Because obviously, you know, reacting to them or being reactive isn't going to help. And like you said, it's going to be kind of like you're giving them the keys to, you know, your your stability or your happiness, or you know, you're giving them that power. Um, so how can you resolve that in a way where it's, you know, you're actually going to help them?
So, can you guys hear me? I don't see my light coming
I'm
in.
sorry, you kind of, the sound went out.
One sec.
I can't hear you.
All right. All right. So initially, I would say to drop any expectation that you can help the person at all, because that's gonna get in the way. Um, any expectation that your position in the relationship is to be of service in their enlightenment, in their expansion, to drop the expectation and to resolve to not contribute to the field of suffering in that moment.
I see. So kind of let that resolve, and it's okay. I see. Yeah, maybe that moment isn't the best moment to better them. All right,
It's
that makes
not
sense.
it's not that you can't better them. It's not that that wouldn't happen. It's that the the when one creates any expectation of that, it influences the intention, and it makes the person into someone to be it sets up this dynamic that is a little bit difficult to really authentically uh, connect. Um, it just creates a dynamic. It's a little challenging for me to actually even highlight all the aspects of the dynamic, but in general, that dynamic is challenging to be truly able to be well, because the priority of this practice is to do what is necessary to sustain the emotional balance, the state of compassion and lovingness, and not to fall into anger or sorrow with this person. And as soon as I am creating this hope that I can help the person when I can't, it leads to some turbulence inside of myself.
Your impermanence. Yeah, I totally get that. Um, yeah. So my thing is like, there's, what if I'm in that setting where that's expected,
To do
you know,
what?
to help that individual to kind of like, because yeah, you could just de-escalate the issue if you want, and honestly, you know, reacting or anything like that. So what if you're in that setting, if that's your job, you know,
Is
like
that your
you
job?
have,
Like, is this a real
uh,
situation?
I, it's definitely something that I plan on pursuing again, but I have been in those
Yeah,
situations.
yeah. Okay, I understand.
And yeah, where I was in a job, had a job, and that was, you know, was expected of me.
In that situation, I would say you also don't expect to help the person.
I
Um,
agree with that now. Now that you've mentioned that, that's okay.
yeah. What you do is you maintain a high emotional state, regardless of what they're doing. This does a couple things. Is it protects you, and it also demonstrates directly to this person that they also don't need to react in the way they're reacting, and it gives them this anchor this anchor of wellness, that despite their trauma or what they're going through, there's an energy here that is calm, that is safe, that I can open up to, that I can be myself with, because it on my own it's too on their own it's too destabilizing, it's too scary. With someone else who's stable, who's not falling into that state with them, all of a sudden they can open up and deal with their traumas, their stuff in such a way that they never were able to, because everyone was trying to help them, everyone was falling into the state their state, and they it's not that they're thinking this, but they will recognize a stability you have, and that will appear in their emotions as, oh, this is a safe space to be vulnerable. Okay.
Oh, that's wonderfully said.
Yeah. Uh, so, um, and you also leave that situation, whether it went well or poorly for that person, in a state of wellness, and you're not rolling in your bed that night, you know, thinking about it, because you don't want, you don't want to not have this skill in that type of a position. You need to be able to go home, to go to your kids and your wife, and have no scars. Um, so that's why it's very protective. It's like like there's those commercials that talk about like heart protection, and they have like those like, or like Cheerios, they like have the little energy field around the heart. It's like that, except like actually real. I mean, like that stuff will just I don't know. I mean, Cheerios are fine. I don't think it really matters. um, it's just to learn how to do this is pretty counterintuitive to the generic prescription of society. It's very counterintuitive, and it's quite. It seems just initially it seems not possible, but I'm sure to a baby or to some creature who has never been able to construct thoughts, that felt impossible. To think that, imagine not being able to think, then one day you're able to think. Well, how did you do it? It's like that. It's like, well, one day you're not able to control your emotional state, and then one day you have this unbounded love for people. How did you do it? Well, you just practiced, and had a good determination to do it. Um, and you can't get better at this as fast through the intellect as you can through intuition. You excel with intuition, and that sort of, when I mean intuition, I mean non-verbal intelligence. Um, so anything non-verbal, non-intellectual intelligence. I think that's a better way of describing intuition than saying intuition, because people always have their presumptions about intuition. So non-verbal, non-intellectual intelligence will serve the development of these emotional states a lot faster. It requires some self-trust. Trust in the self that isn't actually based on narratives and words and memory.
Hey, Julian,
Yeah, what's up?
how often do you find, I know it's specific to each context and person, but how often do you find that silence is the most skillful action? Not silence, but actually no verbal words, you know?
When you think it would be better for the other person to sit with their thoughts. Like, sometimes someone will be in a certain place where to respond to their inquiry or their comments is to buy into what is keeping them limited even more. And as someone who's interested in their alleviation of suffering, the last thing you'll do is contribute to the narratives they've held to entrap themselves in sorrow. And sometimes it's better to not engage at the level they're requesting you to engage at, because the level they're requesting you to engage at is reinforcing of some pattern that isn't skillful. And to be silent is to create an invitation to see to see a new thing, to see something else. But I never have a protocol. Like, there's no hard protocol I have. It's always based on the sometimes, yeah, it's I usually don't just not respond to people because people will don't understand what that means. They'll typically assume you're being arrogant, and they'll typically get upset with you. And it can be quite an arrogant thing to do to not respond to someone if the context is, say, um, you're not sitting on top of a throne, and you decide to sit and you decide to be silent to someone. How pretentious. Um, what I do, or what I would suggest, is to uh, the equivalent of silence to dis is to sidestep the frame that they might be presenting. So if they're in a particular frame of mind, um, you can respond in such a way that doesn't meet them where they're at. Because if you meet them where they're at, sometimes it reinforces where they're at. If they respect you, they'll make an attempt to meet you where you're at. And if they can do that in some situations, it's better than working on, say, if they're really into how bad they are at something, you could say, well, you know, I knew this person who sucked at this, and then eventually they were good at it. So you're presenting a new way of something. This is a poor example, but something like that.
I just find like you were saying about intuition, that like said someone, and it might just be the intuition to be silent, to let people sit with their thoughts, but it's like I see people like talking to me, and I see these like cookie cutter answers that like I'm like conditioned to respond, like, you know, to make them feel better, or whatever, just like small talk responses, and then it just leaves me with like nothing that I feel good about saying, like a lot. So I just kind of just sit there, and not like sit there dazed and confused, just like
Yeah.
sit there.
Um, I mean, yeah, I mean, there's some people I don't talk about like this stuff with. I don't talk about spiritual development. I don't talk about emotional stability. I don't even talk about well-being necessarily, because they haven't demonstrated an interest. Like if I do, sometimes I will talk about it, and there'll be this glossing over, or this pure intellectual discussion, um, or they'll want to enter into like sort of traditional ways of talking, like you sort of just mentioned. Like it'll be sort of like the dialogue that you see in NPCs, very predictable, very not even really responding to each other, but just sort of filling the air with sounds that they've heard before and that are comforting for some reason. And in that type of thing, the silence is the equivalent of me engaging with them. That's basically, it's just completely, it's like white noise. And so sometimes I will just have white noise because that's the most skillful thing, it seems. Because there's, yeah, it's just, you don't have, like, there's no impulse here to help teach this to everybody I talk to. Because it's not, it wouldn't be skillful, because not everyone wants to talk about this stuff, or is interested. And it's not considerate of me to do that with people. And it's not considerate to myself to give my time to a black hole, because I have a limited amount of energy. Which is, I mean, that's debatable, but within the normal world, I have a limited amount of energy.
Yeah.
Yeah, in like everyday life. And I noticed that when I had a higher standard for who I talked to this stuff about, the quality of my own understanding and my appreciations of the teachings increased. My respect for the teachings increased because I wasn't giving it to everyone that was sitting that just existed. It's almost like if I have something valuable and I give it out to everybody in my ecosystem, sort of my social ecosystem in my mind, the value of that asset is extremely low and extremely, you know, at some point you can go above that, but when you're sort of learning about this stuff, you can get really excited and want to share it with everybody, but I'd recommend seeing the value in not doing that. Anyway, we can just have a discussion here.
Yeah, does anybody have anything to add on to this? Because I could talk for days about that. That was fantastic. Yeah. Does anybody want to share?
I have like an example where like it was needed like a few days ago. Like it's similar to what you were saying, Magic. It's like my dad a few days ago, he just texted like me and my siblings like a bunch of like hateful messages for like no apparent reason, just out of thin air. And of course, like as a result of that, like I noticed anger. And in that moment, it's easy to immerse myself in that state of anger and give into that and fight fire with fire and just fire back at him. But it's like having the courage to stay grounded in that space of meta and have compassion for him, because I know that he's dealt with a lot. I know where he's coming from because he's my father, and I know what like he's dealt with his struggles, and it's like choosing to be courageous to stay rooted in that and not going down to that level where then later on you look back like fuck, like I wish I didn't say those things. And it was like it took me having to respond in a more skillful way, and it de-escalated the situation. Of course it's not always going to be like that, but yeah, it's, I guess that was one example that I thought about as Julian was talking about it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing.
Yeah, man. I had an experience about maybe 3 months ago where I was battling my ego, and it was quite interesting because I had talked to a friend that was dealing with social anxiety, and I was kind of talking about building up an emotional armor, to where he feels a little bit more confident in a room, and I pretty much gave him, a tool that I found to be later on very harmful. I told him, whenever you walk into a room, just notice everybody's ego. But I was kind of using it in a negative light. I was like, all right, to kind of bolster your ego, but in a negative way, to where you're better than these people. And that's something I was using later on. I had an instance where, I felt like I was being attacked by people, but I cultivated this, by having that sort of, by projecting that narcissism, and I pretty much, I got into this point where, it had escalated and it blew up in my face. And I was just wondering why. What did I do wrong here? And I sat down with somebody, and they laid it down for me. And it made so much sense. I was viewing these people in this negative light when I should have been a lot more compassionate. Instead of viewing the negativity in them, I should have been viewing the full spectrum. Of what makes these people, what makes them tick. Was that you in the past, or seeing yourself in them, and also seeing the beauty in them. And that changed me so much. And you talking about that just reinforced that was wonderfully said. I do have to say that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's funny. I had a similar challenge when I was learning to engage with people socially. You start with this pretty um, a defensive, a lot of defensiveness when you start to engage with strangers, and you start to demonize a lot of it. Um, but strangers are just the same. They're just as scared, in a way. Um, when you come to them, they're more interested in getting rid of you, but that's another discussion. Maybe we'll have a social anxiety talk at some point and how to go into that skillfully. Joe and I can maybe talk on it.
Oh yeah.
Sounds like you big finger as well. I wanted to keep this around an hour, so I'm gonna close this discussion. Um, but I will hang out. I will hang out here for a little while longer.
Yeah, I got class, but good talk. Thank you, Julian.
Yeah, man.
Thank
Thanks.
you everyone for sharing.
Thanks,
See
Joe.
you later.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, I realized later on that I was using that as like emotional armor to protect my vulnerabilities, and then I had to like get down to like why. You know, that makes sense. Why do I have to do that? And what really made me tick? You know, kind of like in Socratic method.
Yeah, that's a oldest version of Vipassana. Well, I guess he was Socrates was born after the Buddha, right? I don't know. Anyway, yes. Yeah, the switch that has to happen is that compassion itself is a reasonable way to respond and perceive things. Before compassion is cultivated enough, it feels wrong and it feels foolish. But even when you see things just logically or rational from a reasonable stance, it makes sense to afford others the space of compassion. And once you kind of see it lets you be free from them, it's very appealing. It's a very appealing thing to cultivate, and you have to practice it. You have to cultivate it. It is more like I'm going to determine to cultivate these states for the next, several months than it is like, oh, I've understood it. Now I'm going to get the benefits of this. No, it's not like that. It's a starting point. Like it's the shovel to understand it, and the actual fruits of this come in daily life. Daily life presents a lot of good opportunities to exercise this muscle. And over time, it does clear up. It does get easier, and it does become more of a sort of a muscle memory type of thing, to not fall into states that you should have compassion towards. Personally, it's a lot easier to. It's become more easy as metta is practiced to do karuna. So metta is the foundation again. You can practice karuna as well, but without having practiced metta, it's like you may not be having the right tone to it. It might easily fall into sorrow. It might easily fall into. And then that comes to the cultivation of metta, which I don't know if I went into that too much, but I'm not going to go into that right now. There's a good book called Path to Nibbana that goes into it that I think is pretty good, right? It's probably the best book on that, in cultivation of metta in sitting practice, I mean, not in daily life. In daily life, listen to Ajahn Sona. And sitting practice, the cultivation of metta from that book is probably the best. Would anyone like to? I'm curious if anybody's how this was heard, and from others who haven't had the chance to speak.
I have a question that kind of speaks to what you just said.
Sure.
So the fact that there's different words, Karuna, Meta, Mudita, could give the impression that like they're different things. And what, correct me if I'm wrong now, what I'm understanding is that they're not. They're all meta, but the context is what's different. Meta in the face of suffering, meta in the face of others' joy. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. It's
Wow.
it's imagine someone you love and now picture them if they're in pain. The problem with that is a lot of people actually do start to suffer when people they love enter pain. So compassion is more of a wisdom. It requires some wisdom, but this the tone you have when someone's in pain, or suffering, or angry, or ill. It's this soft care and understanding that this is a being that's suffering, and this is a being who I have kindness and love for. And so in that state, you will do what you need to do in order to be assistive in the situation, to alleviate what you can in given a reasonable time frame. Like, you're not just going to become a martyr and necessarily give every waking moment to helping. You can, but that's not what compassion is saying. It's just you have that basis of care and love, and what you do with that from the state of Karuna will be pure, much more pure than if you didn't have that. And it isn't different from metta, it's an extension of it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I actually have a follow up on that, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So you mentioned purity. You and I have had like a very short back and forth about that on one of the channels. As you were going through your talk, I kind of recognized a lot of, oh yeah, I do that already in some way, and yet I don't identify as a person who like gets it. And you mentioned to me that like you can have a kind of like an impure meta, but by extension an impure karuna or something. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that. Like, my point is basically a lot of the things that I heard you say in the talk would seem to extend not just to like pure karuna, but also this impure kind where you haven't dropped off enough of worry or depression or anxiety to really feel it, and yet there's some sort of connection. So I just wonder if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah. We all have aspects of compassion and loving kindness in our personalities. If we didn't have any of that, it probably would be really hard for us to have survived socially up to this point. So there are aspects of these two qualities in most people's personalities and emotional structures. The difference between that and the suggestion of metta and karuna as described in the texts is that we are essentially taking what our current understanding of loving kindness and refining it until it's sort of like you're taking gold and you have a rock that has 20% gold in it, but the other 80% is like iron. You have to melt it away and refine it until there's only gold left, and then from that point the analogy breaks down, because in personal experience it's not just the small amount of loving kindness you had without the anger. It's actually as if the entire person is actually filled with it. So it's like an increase. It's an increase of this lovingness. It becomes dominant as a emotional state, and it becomes consistent. So it lasts. It's not up and down. It's not only when you're meditating, but it's consistent, and that's the state that's the state we're after, and that takes practice, and it will be impure for a long time. And actually, disregard that. It will be impure for as long as it takes for you to refine it, which could be short or long. And our understanding of it now isn't yet quite pure. It's not if we were to go practice or act out what we understand, we would inevitably likely end up falling into certain states of sorrow. And our job at that point is when we find ourselves in an emotional imbalance of loss, say we've lost something or someone, or we're compassionate in such a way that is causing ourselves pain, it's our prerogative to ask the question, um, basically, is this the compassion of Karuna? And you want to say, have a pretty high standard as, okay, well, is there suffering in this? Is there unnecessary suffering in this? Sometimes there'll just be sort of like an understanding of loss, but the understanding of loss isn't necessarily suffering. And the job of the practitioner at that point is to figure out how to emotionally navigate to a space of more peace, of more lovingness. So it's really to actually challenge yourself to, when you're in a negative state, to find your way back home and find equanimity, or metta in this case. Equanimity is good too, it's a basis for metta. But it's not, what typically will happen is if in the impure state, the prerogative isn't to get back to the state of wellness, of metta. What happens in the impure state is when you enter compassion, or some state that isn't yet fully developed of whatever, and you start to feel bad, you don't actually try to get back. You either recriminate yourself for feeling that way, which is unwise and unskillful, or you assume you've just failed. So those are the two things you have to watch out for as you're practicing, is when you fall into negative states, don't just immediately recriminate yourself and feel guilty for having fallen into a state of suffering, and don't just assume you failed. See it as a challenge that or see it as a skill set that you're building, and see it as an opportunity that's arisen because of a pre-existing attachment that you now are interested in feeling okay in regard to. And if you can do that, then you're learning how to balance this Brahmavihara, in the Brahmavihara better. And this is necessary. This is the necessary progression, is you will have it and you will fall out of it, and then you will have to learn how to get back. But throughout that whole process, you have to have equanimity, you have to be able to deal with failure in such a way that you don't feel shame, in such a way that you don't feel guilt, in such a way that you don't look at yourself as inadequate because you weren't able to have metta for this whole, period of time.
That's really helpful. Thanks again for a great talk.
Yeah, thank you. If there's any more questions, we can go into that. Otherwise, thank you everybody for participating. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks, Joanne.
Thanks, Julian.
Thank you, Julian.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, guys. Be well. Find ways to challenge yourself in regard to this, and see if you can't love those who you hate. Or even those who just mildly upset you. If you can't figure it out, just ask the question, who's hurt the people I love? And then start there. Well, really start with yourself. Start with yourself. And if you really want to challenge that, then start with, if you're really able to do that with yourself and love yourself fully, then start at who hurts those people I love, and am I able to love them? For example, for me, I love animals, and there are many people that hurt animals. And my work is to see those people without eyes of hatefulness, and hope that my presence and my existence in this world will serve to benefit those people who haven't, say, developed compassion for the animals. I'm not going to help them through hatefulness. My energy isn't helpful in that way. Or I love spiritual people, so I hate the people who hurt them, or whatever. So And then the, oh yeah, it's people, who has hurt people I love, and who has hurt me. Who has hurt me, who has hurt people I love. And the more compassion you have for these people, the more unburdened you will be. It's a certainty. You'll be less burdened. You'll live life lighter. You'll have more freedom. You'll be more easygoing. You'll be less tense. You'll probably have more energy as well. And also you'll help the people that you hate, even though right now you may not want to help them. But if you help them, they'll be less worthy of your hate. They'll be less agitated, and they might have more skills to grow. So take that and do what you will with it. I'm gonna go and probably meditate. Talk to y'all later.
See you, man.
Thanks again.